I bet all of us have imagined what it would possibly be like if we could go back and experience the things that the disciples experienced. And maybe you've imagined what you would personally like to go back and be a part of. And think about, okay, what would it have been like to actually be there and see what had happened? And you'd probably see some amazing things like feeding the 5,000, maybe the transfiguration, and of course the resurrection. I think, at least in my top 5 choices, would be one that we're going to talk about here in a second. I often wonder how I would react. I think most of us think, boy, if I'd been back there, if I'd been one of the 12, I would have done better. You see them making mistakes, say, I would have done better. But we, of course, we have more information than they did. And maybe I sometimes suspect if I would have done worse. But one moment in particular that would have definitely be on my list is when Jesus was walking on the water. And I think that stands out to me, first of all, because of how just so wildly strange it is. There's some things that I bet if you'd been walking by and seen it happening, it wouldn't have jumped out right away, like feeding of the 5,000. It was kind of relatively subtle by comparison, as opposed to this man walking across the surface of the water. If you look at Matthew 14, if you stay there, we're going to look at some details here, maybe some things you've never noticed. And as always, I never stop noticing things that have been there the whole time. But this is written down not to just tell us what happened. It's written down to tell us something important about Jesus, and I believe it's written down to tell us something about us, even though we will not be experiencing this literally in any fashion. I think it's really worth taking a look at it. I don't know if you're aware of this. It happens right after Jesus feeds the 5,000. Here's Matthew 14:22. So that word immediately is kind of in connection. He just fed 5,000 people miraculously. And 14:22, it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. So he kind of stays behind to kind of dismiss the crowds. And it's 5,000 people. It's going to take a while. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. So the disciples leave Jesus behind. He's sending the crowds away. 5,000 people. I mean, it'll take, a little while. If we were to dismiss right now, it'd take a few minutes for us to head towards the door. You can imagine 5,000 people, even in an open area. It's going to take a while. And I've often imagined, I don't know if it was because of artist renderings or anything like that, or my own imagination, I always pictured the feeding of the 5,000 taking place in daylight, maybe like our potluck's going to be. But it was late in the day. In fact, that's why the food was an issue. If you look at verse 15, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. So when you picture the disciples getting the boat after this and Jesus dismissing the crowds, it's getting dark. It's late. In fact, it was late when they started eating. And it had already been a busy day. It's about to get busier. Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray, and the disciples get in a boat. You don't just hop in a boat. It takes some prep time, and they get that set up, and they're on their way. And I believe this is why what happens next happens in the middle of the night. Matthew 14:25, and in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And I love how matter-of-fact this is. He's walking on the sea with the same tone as when he went up on the mountain. And here we learn what time it is. Some of your versions will say the fourth watch. If you check out a footnote, maybe it's there. It's about 3 to 5 a.m. I am not at my best at 3 to 5 a.m. If at all possible, I prefer to be unconscious during this stretch. I'm sure you do too. I think this is significant for at least 2 reasons why this is mentioned. It's the worst time of day to deal with stuff. It's dark, and they've already had a full day. I'm going to do another brief flashback. This is before the feeding of the 5,000. This is earlier the same day. I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have walking on the water. Before that was the feeding of the 5,000. Before that, Jesus heard about his cousin being executed. This all happened in the same day. And he wanted to spend some time alone, and he goes out on a boat on his own. So Jesus ends up being in a boat twice that day, but he's off by himself when he hears about John. But people in the area hear about him being there, and when he comes back ashore, not only are the disciples waiting for him, but there's this huge crowd. So we're going back to Matthew 14:13, trying to paint a picture of how busy this day was. Matthew 14:13, now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself, and when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. I think it's worth pointing out the events of the days, and of course, all these events were the hardest on Jesus. But even if you were a disciple, it'd be pretty rough on you too, just being on the sidelines. First, he gets bad news about John. Then Jesus leaves, and you're waiting for him. And while you're waiting for him, this crowd gathers, and Jesus comes back, and the crowd gets big, 5,000 strong. Jesus is healing people. And there's this meeting about feeding the crowd that would be kind of stressful. So how are we going to handle this? And you, of course, know how that turns out. And then there's the distributing of the baskets. You'd be part of that if you were one of the disciples at that point. And then collecting the baskets. And then you get in a boat. And then it's late. It's late already. And the day is still not over yet. Now on the agenda is a storm. Matthew 14:24 says they are battered by the waves. Probably all of us have been in a boat of some sort at some point, maybe not as many during a storm. We know from Mark 6 that it says they were straining at the oars, and in John 6, this is the same event, it says they were 3 or 4 miles from shore, so they're not nearby if the boat goes down. They're exhausted, they're stressed. It's 3 to 5 in the morning, and then they see someone out on the water, walking on the water. I find it interesting, their first thought is a ghost. Verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. The original word is actually closer to the word phantom. The word is similar to that. They think they're seeing something pretty bad. It's kind of easy to sympathize. It's the middle of the night, maybe not thinking clearly. You're 3 or 4 miles away from shore. It's dark out, and you're seeing something walking out there. That would be terrifying. You would think the worst. And you notice it says they cried out. I never really focused on this before. When men get scared, they usually just kind of jump or gasp a little bit just to save a little bit of male ego. If they actually cry out, that probably means they're feeling a certain amount of real danger. What a relief it must have been to hear Jesus' voice. Say, "It's okay, it's me." Verse 27, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." What they thought was something to fear was something very familiar, and actually someone who's going to rescue them. At this point, the focus of the text kind of shifts. We're not just dealing with a group of disciples. Now we're focusing on one guy. Peter speaks up. And if you were reading this for the first time and didn't know what was about to happen, or if you were there, you might expect Peter to speak up and say something like, "Great, come aboard." Or, "Can you help us out?" Or, I know if I was there, I'd have been like, "How are you doing that?" That would be my comments on the situation. Peter might have said those things. The Bible does not record every single solitary word that's spoken during these situations. But we are given what is spoken. But watching Jesus, Peter gets an idea. I'd love to see the look on his face as he kind of pieced this together in his head. He's realizing there's some possibilities here. If Jesus can walk on the water, maybe I can too. Here's verse 28. Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So based on what he knows about Jesus, Peter is ready to leave the boat and take a risk. And I really admire that about him. Peter doesn't just say, "Here I come." By the way, you notice that? He says, "Command me to come to you." He didn't just hop out of the boat and say, "I'm going to try this too." He said, "If it's you, you command me, and when you say to get out of the boat, I'm going to come out on the water." He's asking permission. Usually he asks permission to come aboard. Peter's not going to step out unless Jesus tells him to, and that's what happened. Jesus tells Peter to come on out. Verse 29. And he said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. I would have loved to see the first step that he took, and also to see the other disciples watching him. I don't know if they're probably not placing bets, but It would be interesting to see the look on their face. Jesus tells Peter to come out, so he does. Now remember, it's dark. It's one thing to be out on the water in daylight. At night, it's completely different, and there's a storm going on. Now, when I grew up, I don't know, again, if it was because I saw somebody's drawing of this, but I always pictured it happening on a flat surface, a very serene, calm surface of water in the daylight. It's after 3 in the morning, and when there's a storm, water is not flat. You know very well that it's up and down and all around, waves and all kinds of stuff. So I can only think of 2 possibilities. Either Jesus, when he was walking on the water, ignored this terrain that was kind of shifting and just kind of levelly walked through, or maybe he followed the train up and down, kind of walking on sudden hills and declines and just kind of kept his balance. I don't know. It doesn't indicate. But it's very important to know that it was not a flat surface. And it's important to know this is what Peter's walking on too, is this heaving, changing landscape. Either way, you begin to understand why someone might get a little uptight. He's not just walking on the water. He's walking on the water in the dark during a storm at about 3 o'clock or after in the morning. And he's had a long day. So Peter had a certain amount of courage to get out. You can imagine, I would just assume he's going to smile. When you're doing something like this, that's got to be a thrill. But it starts to fade. His courage starts to fade, and he loses his composure. And it's because he starts looking over the situation. Here's Matthew 14, verse 30. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Now, you cannot see wind. It says seeing the wind. So he's not seeing the wind. We know what he's seeing. He's seeing the effects of the wind. He's seeing the process. He saw what the wind was doing to the surface of the water. That's about the only thing that the wind's changing. Maybe the boat, maybe look back at the boat. I don't know. He's seeing the effects of the wind, and he became afraid and began to sink. Jesus' ability to support Peter on the water did not change. It did not fade. It was Peter's lack of faith that changed. His faith while he was in the boat was fine, and his faith during the first few steps was fine. It's when he started kind of eyeing his surroundings. But Peter isn't just brave, he's also smart, he's wise, and he knows what needs to happen next. When he needs help, he calls out to Jesus, and notice there's no delay. Matthew 14:31. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, you have little faith, why did you doubt? Jesus immediately rescues Peter. Here's a little more conjecture. Since the rescue was immediate, either Jesus moved really fast from a distance to come rescue him, or he was right there. My guess is he was right there because it says he stretched out his hand. So they're probably standing there side by side. So there's this moment when everything's all right. Peter and Jesus, the storm's around them, both standing on the water, maybe walking around a little bit. But the problem begins when Peter starts focusing on the storm. And the problem ends when he relies on Jesus. Here's Matthew 14:32. I find this interesting. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, you are certainly God's son. There's another important order of events here. It's easy to miss. I think it's significant. First, Jesus keeps Peter from sinking. That's pretty much a priority. Then Jesus asks while they're still out on the water, why did you doubt? Then they get in the boat, and then the storm stops. Peter's preference, I suspect, would be stop the storm, get in the boat, then we'll talk about my faith. But that's not where it's happening. I think it's worth pointing out the question, why did you doubt, is being asked while they're still standing out on the water in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. And you can almost picture Peter saying, why did I doubt? The evidence is all around them. All kinds of reasons. It's dark out. I'm exhausted. I've never walked on the water before. There's a storm. The water's moving everything around. But regardless, Jesus asked that very important question, why did you doubt? And the question is valid. All the reasons to be afraid are not. And that's kind of what he's pointing out. He's allowing the evidence there to remain while he asks the question, why did you doubt? None of these are good reasons to doubt. I'm here. Could list all the reasons, but none of them matter when Jesus is there. If Jesus is involved, the night, the storm, the danger, it's all irrelevant. So I would argue this is more than just a story. It's an account of what happened, but it teaches us something about the amazing power of Jesus. It also reveals the truth about our relationship, about Peter's relationship with Jesus and our relationship with Jesus. I think it's not a stretch to suggest that our Christianity is a lot like Peter walking on the water, and I'm sure it's been suggested before. It kind of implies three people. See if this works. There's the people back on the shore. They're not even in the vicinity. They're at least 3 or 4 miles away, probably asleep by now. Crowds who see only the surface of Jesus. They want his help. They're interested in the food and maybe all the fringe benefits, but not necessarily following him. They know Jesus from a distance, and that's like most of the world. Everybody's kind of aware of him, but let us know how it goes out, there. Being serious about your Christianity, we'll be on the shore. There's those who are in the boat. They're, I guess, a little bit better. They're following Jesus, but only to a point, not out on the water like Peter. They're fine with Jesus getting in the boat. You're welcome to hang out with me, Jesus. Ready to follow until it's difficult. Maybe very interested in following Jesus down a road, but not so much out on the water. Christianity with limits. I think a lot of people fall in that category too. And then there's Peter, who seems apparently ready to follow Jesus anywhere. And I think that might be the only true version of a Christian that we should all aspire to. True Christianity is following Jesus when it's easy, but also when it's scary. And we try. Like Peter, we step out of the boat, and it's not always easy. Once we're out there, it's not easy to maintain that steady state of mind. Like today, we'll be around Christians, we'll eat together, and we'll have a certain amount of stamina in our souls. But then you get to looking around at the world, and especially if there's a storm. I don't know what troubles you might be facing right now. And when there's trouble, things to worry about, it's easy to start sinking. But even then, when we fail and begin to sink, we can ask for help from Jesus, and he will respond immediately. If you're a Christian, you have immediate forgiveness if you repent and ask for forgiveness. And when we doubt, it's just like Peter. None of our reasons are valid. What about the money situation and the health situation in the future? It says doesn't change anything. The reasons are invalid. The only thing that matters is if you're right with Jesus. Sometimes even if we're right with Jesus, the storm may still continue. See, we want the storm to stop right now, kind of like Peter probably did, but Jesus is more interested in the storm inside you. That's what he was doing with Peter out on the water there. So, I'm gonna stop the storm, this storm, but first we need to deal with this storm. And then we'll move on to the other one, the lesser storm. Reading about Peter out on the water forces us to face some important questions. How much are you willing to trust God? How much are you willing to trust his word? Enough to last outside this building, enough to get out of the boat, enough to challenge yourself. I'll tell you really quick about an old movie I saw years ago. It was an old Humphrey Bogart movie, not one of his famous ones. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It was called The Desperate Hours. And he played a bad guy, and it was about, just briefly, it's about this family's taken hostage by some bad guys. And they're actually living in the house. They take the family hostage. And every day the father, the good guy, has to go to work knowing that his family is being held hostage and he can't say anything to anybody, and he has to go out into his life and pretend like everything is okay and then come home to the situation. And it goes on for quite a while. But eventually the father comes up with a plan to rescue his family, to escape with them. And unfortunately it doesn't go perfectly, as well as he had planned. And in fact, his son, a very young boy, is grabbed by the bad guy. The bad guy grabs his son before the two of them, in fact, it's just the son and the father who have yet to escape. Everybody else is safe. And the bad guy has a gun on the young boy. And he tells the boy, do not move a muscle. But the father is standing across the room, and he ignores the bad guy. He looks at his son. He says, son, come here. And the bad guy tells the son, he says, if you take one step, I'll pull the trigger. He's just kind of not even holding him. He's just holding the gun right there. And the father says, son, come here. He looks him right in the eye. He says, come here. Bad guy again says, I mean it. You take one step towards your dad, I will pull the trigger. And the father ignores him, and he looks at his son. He says, son, come here. And the son You can see it on his face. Okay, so he takes a step towards his father, and the bad guy does pull the trigger. But what the bad guy didn't know is that earlier the father had removed all the bullets. And the son reaches his father safely and escapes. The bad guy did not know the gun was empty, but neither did the son. All the son knew was that there was a gun, and it was pointed at him, and he knew it was a bad guy holding it. As far as he knew, the gun was loaded. But the one thing that trumped all of that the son knew for sure, that overshadowed everything else, his father was telling him to do something. And based on everything around him, all his surroundings, the storm, so to speak, obeying his father would be a mistake, but he did it anyway. He didn't know everything his father knew. He just knew that he trusted his father. That was enough. And as a result, he escaped a horrible situation and was safe. There's a lot of people who wear the name Christian. We all know that. It's kind of a popular label. And some, I guess it's all important for all of us to consider where we are. Some are like those on the shore. We're willing to hang out with Jesus occasionally and get what we want. And then there's some that are like in the boat, willing to follow Jesus, but only so far. And we're willing to obey God to a point. I'm convinced more and more the only way to really be a Christian is to follow Christ. It really is that simple. And that means when it's easy and when it's tough. Sometimes doing what the Bible says will be easy, and obeying our Father will fit our ideas, but sometimes everything around you might say obeying your Father is a mistake. And you might be reduced to that one simple fact. My Father is telling me to do something. I don't know everything my Father knows. I just know He's my Father, and I trust Him. One of the most important things to learn from Peter is to know when it's time to ask for help. And I don't know about you, but I need help. And you might be in the middle of a storm right now, and it's a really good idea to make sure that you and Jesus are all right. We all know there are storms on the way. We're all going to get our turns with that. And when it happens, you don't want Jesus in the vicinity. You want Him right next to you. If you need prayers, we're going to be singing a song here in a moment, and you can come forward and ask for those prayers. If you need to be baptized into Jesus and to have Him standing with you on the water, so to speak, that opportunity is also available if you want to come forward. This next song is meant to be an opportunity for you to do that and to let us know what you need. But whether you come forward or not, make sure you're right with Jesus and that you're standing next to Him. It's the only safe place to be. Pray you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.
Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord.